Why is Lux always good or at least decent? I would not say that Lux is always good in mid lane. We'll start with that. I think there's actually a lot of metas where Lux is really bad in mid lane, but she's very fun, so even in times when she's weak, a lot of people just play her because of how insanely fun she is to play. She's just one of those characters that regardless of power is going to have a lot of people playing her because fun. That said, it's like, I think there's some characters who are like fairly resilient to feeling powerful and feeling viable. What I mean by that is there's some characters like regardless of how you change items, they're gonna feel mostly fine and they'll adapt. And I think Lux tends to be one of those characters. It's like, oh, if the assassin burst items are bad, she could build some of the other mage items instead. If the mage items are bad, perhaps she could build some of the support items, right? Like, Lux has a lot of items that are potentially viable on her, and so if one set of items gets nerfed too much, there's another set she could probably move to. And so I think one mark of a character who can often be good is that, are they resilient to shifts in meta? Which I think, again, Lux often is the case that it's true. Not always, sometimes she can be bad. Comparatively, as an example, like a character like, Kale isn't as resilient to shifts in the meta or certain items. Like, Kale, as an example, is very dependent on Nashor's Tooth. And so if Nashor's Tooth ever changes, that's a big deal for whether or not Kale feels viable. There's certain AD carries. Actually, one of the supports that tends to really go up and down with meta shifts is Senna, because Senna is like a really weird character who has really weird interactions with the item system. And so there's certain changes to the item system that can make Senna go absolutely insanely crazy, way too OP. And there's other changes to the item system that can make Senna feel like straight up useless. Like this happened when we put the mythic items into the game. It's like Senna got a lot weaker and like Phlox had to giga buff her at one point. And so, yeah, maybe that's why Lux always feels good, is her kit is often perhaps resilient to meta shifts and resilient to certain items being good or bad. Yeah. And I don't think that's a mark of a good or a bad character, by the way. I just think it's a mark of a different character. I will say, though, that one of the potential risks a character has for not being resilient, so again, I don't think not being resilient is not necessarily bad, but if a character isn't resilient to changes in the game, they require maintenance. And that can be bad for a character, because a character who requires maintenance must receive the maintenance. Like, as an example, it's actually fairly fortunate for Shaco that Phlox knows a lot about Shaco and cares a lot about Shaco, because Shaco's the kind of character who his AP or AD build, based on the meta, could definitely need maintenance. And so you're going to have metas where like one of Shaco's builds is going to completely disappear, and that can be really rough for him. But, there's folks like Phlox around who like understand the character, and like they can sometimes, will identify like, oh, this build needs some adjustments, and then potentially can do it. And so the downside of a character that needs maintenance is that if they don't get that maintenance, they can end up feeling pretty bad. And, there's a lot of work to do, right? Especially at the times where things like items change. So a character who's resilient to changes will often just feel good all the time, whereas a character who's not resilient will often have moments where they feel potentially bad and will need that maintenance. And again, it doesn't mean it's a bad design, but it does mean sometimes characters are needing follow-up that it can sometimes take a bit of time for them to get. When reworking a champ, do you have to do a deep dive researching and playing them? I think it can be helpful. I'm not going to say it's required. I say I like doing it. So something you may have seen me stream before, or at least people have been around for a while, is when I rework a character, I will often stream it and collect some small amount of feedback from the community. The community being anybody who shows up to the stream who has opinions. And so like I did this with TALIYAH, I did this with Rengar as an example, did this with Wukong, where, I would just hop on stream and, play them for a number of games and be like writing down like, okay, this thing feels weird, this thing feels kind of off. There's this person who came into my chat and they mentioned that this auto attack reset is bugged and all those things. And so often that, for me personally, with my personal process, can be very helpful for like reworking a character, and ends up with a list kind of like this. Here, I'll show you. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. This is the list for TALIYAH's gameplay update. There is a lot of changes. A lot of changes. And one of the reasons this list is so long, even though she didn't get like a full rework, a lot of these are just adjustments to spells. One of the reasons this list is so long is because when I was playing TALIYAH, all this stuff came up when I was playing her, as well as when people were giving me feedback on her, as well as when my teammates were giving me feedback on her. So it wasn't just me. There was also like other people at Riot who were TALIYAH players or cared about TALIYAH, who like when they knew she was being reworked, they'd come to me and be like, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And so a number of these lines are just like trying to like make certain things feel better. And so as an example, I played her and I would constantly try to jump off the wall, and it would never put me where I wanted to go. And so one of the things we added is inputting a movement command during the surf now causes TALIYAH to jump off towards that location. And I increased the range of the jump, so you could be more like intentional where you're ending. And like that was a result of like playing it and being like, man, I feel like this wall is so hard to end up in a good spot. And I often will just get myself killed in ways that feel pretty bad. And so it was like, hey, can we make that feel better while, you know, still being balanced, still being fair. And another thing about her like was like someone gave a lot of feedback on like how the W felt like it was like a bit too random to hit in terms of, you know, how good is it for TALIYAH versus opponents. I think Flux might have been one of the people who gave that feedback. I can't remember. So I was like, we should try testing just the W just being a little more in TALIYAH's favor to see how that feels and if that like is a good direction for her. So yeah, basically, I guess what I'm saying is like, I think it can definitely be, when you're reworking a character, worthwhile to go get some games on them just to, you know, understand like what feels good, what feels bad. And then, you know, I think one thing that I feel very fortunate for as a dev is that if I stream a character like TALIYAH, there's definitely going to be like, you know, a couple people who show up and, you know, give me some feedback. And so that's always nice to be able to collect feedback. Or like if I say, you know, post something about things, like I'm going to get people to say like, hey, here's this thing, have you thought about it? And that can be useful because, you know, I'm not going to know everything. I'm not going to be omnipotent. I'm not going to be able to know every bug and every inconsistency and every bad feeling thing. And so it can be very useful to understand things and, you know, get those thoughts. I will note, though, that like one of the important things there, too, is that you can't just make everything feel good. You might just make an overpowered character then. My TALIYAH rework was fairly overpowered when it came out. And just because, like, say a main of a character says to change something doesn't mean you should do it. Sometimes, like, you know, a lot of mains of a character are going to, like, want certain things that might be, like, not okay to give them. And so you do, as a game dev, well, it's great to get feedback and take feedback. And like hear it out. Like it doesn't necessarily mean you should blindly do everything people talk about. Sometimes it can be like, it can end up with very, very bad results, depending on what you do. And so the way I like doing it as the way I like thinking about a lot of player feedback as a dev is kind of like going from it with the mind of, this player told me something. Okay, point one, they told me something. That means they have a feeling of a certain problem, right? Question one, is the problem true? Sometimes it's not really a problem. Question two, in what ways would fixing this problem make the character better, right? Question three, in what ways would fixing this problem make the character worse, right? Because sometimes if you fix a problem, the character has to be nerfed or changed in certain ways to account for that, and that can make the character worse. You know, question four, would the average player of this character like this? Things like that, right? And so it's not saying, hey, someone told me this, therefore I should just do it. It's saying, hey, someone told me this. Great, now I know about it. And now, as a designer, let me go dig into it and try to like see if it should be changed, and if so, what should the change be, and what's a good change there. And so it's like, again, it's the idea of don't necessarily blindly follow the feedback, but instead like accept that the feedback exists and try to understand what the best course of action is going forward now that you know that there's this potential thing that is off.